Hello, everybody. Welcome to another That Word Chat. It's so great to see so many people in the room here for Crystal Shelley. Crystal is we're we're involved with so many things together, and she's become such a good friend in a short time. We've never met, of course, because pandemic has kept us apart. So it's great to be able to spend an hour talking with her right now. Crystal is a copy editor. Her website is Red Pen Rabbit. I mean, we'll ask why. And Rabbit with a red pen, I guess. And Crystal, so you're fairly new to the editing scene.
I am.
You're you have a master's in social work, and you spent some years working as a social worker. So tell us about the transition. What was the motivation to get into copy editing?
Yeah, they were never really related.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed editing. I think a lot of us did just growing up in school, you know, reading friends' papers, spotting typos, errors, that kind of thing, but I never thought of it as a career option. I always knew that I wanted to go into a helping profession. So at one point, I thought about becoming a teacher, but then decided not to. I took a high school psychology class and loved it. So I got my bachelor's in psychology, quickly realized you can't really do much with a bachelor's in psychology. Like I could go the
Mhm.
PhD route, but wasn't for me. So anyway, I decided to become a social worker, practiced for 8 years in hospice, memory care, and long-term care. And throughout all that, I think around 2017, I know a freelance copy editor, and she would work with indie authors and would provide like beta reading through people she knew. So I started out as a beta reader for her
Mhm.
and would send her my feedback, not directly to the author, but to this editor. And I would spot mistakes and provide feedback that, I think many copy editors, line editors would. And she said, you should look into this because you're good at it. And so I started looking into it, but again, practicing social work this whole time and um, started just looking into what it would take to be an editor. And then I had a job transition in early 2019 around Memorial Day. And we were told that our management company was changing. So my position as a social worker was in jeopardy because not many um, memory cares, which is what I was working in, employ social workers. So I didn't know if I would have a job. So my husband had been encouraging me to look at editing because I wasn't super happy in my position. And I'm like, no, I don't have time to do this. I have a full time job. I'd have to spend nights and weekends on it.
Right.
But anyway, so when that announcement came in Memorial Day, it was the fire that was lit under me, and I
Yeah.
filed for a business license that same week. I came up with my business name, everything. I'm like, I may not have a job, so maybe this is the time that I do it. So in June 2019, I filed for a business license and plan to slowly maybe start looking for clients and all of that. Decided I did not like the new management company and
Mhm.
left my full-time job in October of 2019. So it's been
Mhm.
exactly 2 years. So
Well,
that was a
congratulations
long-winded
on
way to explain
that's
that.
okay. No, that's good. That's very interesting. And happy anniversary if it's about 2 years.
Thank
Um,
you.
so let's first get out of the way. Rabbit with a red pen.
Yes.
What is that? We get the red pen part, I
Right.
guess. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I didn't, like I said, everything happened quickly. Before that announcement at Memorial Day, I'd never even thought about actually starting an editing business, but, and I couldn't come up with a name. So
Mhm.
I was trying to picture like, just visualize what things would even look like. And I kept thinking of a logo, and rabbits are my Chinese zodiac. So I am Chinese, and I have always identified with rabbits. It's how I would draw myself just as a kid. I
Hmm.
have this very, there's just a way that I drew rabbits to represent myself. My grandfather was also a rabbit. So like for his birthday, I would draw like a big bunny and a little one to represent us and
Hmm.
stuff like that. So when I was coming up with a logo idea, I kept thinking, oh, I want it to be a rabbit holding a red pen. And that name just stuck with me. And
All right.
that, yeah, after that, I'm like, I can't really picture anything else. And
Yeah.
nothing else seems to really speak to who I am as a person and represent me that way. So
Yeah.
that's what it
Okay.
was.
Makes absolute sense. And rabbits are cute and it's memorable. So why not? I did Mark Allen editing, uh, not very creative. And then I changed it after a year or so to Mark Allen editorial.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so that's my transition of that's the story of my business name. In case anybody wondered, how did you come up with that as a business name? So I'm interested in, so you said you were a beta reader, so that's interesting because something you do now is the sensitivity reading.
Mhm.
Is that a similar kind of thing? Does one inform the other?
Right. Yeah. And my beta reading was super informal. Like I didn't have
Hmm.
any training or anything like that.
Mhm.
Um, but sensitivity reading, which I call authenticity reading now, but they are interchangeable.
Hmm.
It's essentially, it is very similar in that it's providing feedback to the writer about what's working, what's not working, the plot, the characters, all of that. But it's from the specific lens of my lived experience or my identities. So some people call authenticity reading targeted beta reading because
Hmm.
it's a way to frame what the service is. That I think a lot of authors understand and value beta readers and have no qualms in working with beta readers, but there's often hesitation and reluctance to hire or even entertain the idea of authenticity reading. So by framing it as this targeted beta reading, it's a way to reframe in the writer's mind what that service actually is. So it has definitely helped me just in the fact, or just from a like an assessment standpoint and being able to provide feedback to writers. Like they're very similar. It's just looking at it from a different perspective.
Mhm. So why, yeah, so why authenticity reading? How does that differ? Why do you think it's a better name?
Yeah. So I am not the only person who calls it that or the first person who calls it that. I've gotten asked that
Mhm.
before, like, oh, did you come up with that? I did
Yeah.
not come up with it. Um, but I kind of went back and forth. So when I first started using or started offering the service, I did call it targeted beta reading, but then I would always feel that I had to call it sensitivity reading too, because that's really, from what I've seen, the most common term for it used in publishing that authors are going to recognize easily. So I would always say, oh, targeted beta reading, AKA sensitivity reading. So then I just thought, oh, I should just call it sensitivity reading and be good with that. And in my ACEs presentation on it last year, I kind of made a flippant remark that I do regret saying, like, oh, if
Mhm.
an author isn't, if they're not going to hire me because I call it sensitivity reading, then they're probably not ready for the service anyway. But I've since looked at it differently that there is so much resistance to the service because many people think, oh, it's about censorship, it's about people being
Hmm.
oversensitive, and why should I have to change what I say or censor myself because they're just trying to cancel me, all of that
Yeah.
rhetoric around authenticity reading that I said, I kind of thought if there are any barriers to authors engaging the service, then I want to do what I can to break those down. So if calling it sensitivity reading is even the slightest barrier, then how can I shift that? And I feel that authenticity, while it is not a perfect term because it can suggest that there is one authentic representation of an identity or an experience, I feel that it's still asking a person with that lived experience or identity to read with authenticity. They're not reading it to make it authentic, but they're reading it through the lens of what's authentic to them. So to me, I feel like it is a term that better captures the goals and the intent of the service than sensitivity reading. But I still do say, when I talk about it, I often say commonly called sensitivity reading, but then I pretty much only use authenticity reading in my language.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a personal choice, but
yeah, and we're all about personal choice. That's good. So what is your answer? I mean, you brought up the sort of the rhetoric of a person who's writing is going to write stories with different characters. So I mean, we write in terms of fiction about what we know, but we also have to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. And I think there's the same, I think this also maybe holds true in other forms of art, in acting and, things like that. So what is the answer? What is your answer to people who say, look, yes, I'm a white person but I'm writing a character who is a woman who has an Asian friend and there's a black person who's a main character, and I'm putting myself in their shoes to, as best I can, to write about their experience. Why should I go to you or to anybody else to question that, to cancel that, to object to it?
Yeah, that's a big question. So there are a lot of parts to that. For one, I will say, because I do get asked this, I don't think blanketly that no one should write outside their identities. People do ask that, or they are wary of doing that with good reason. But one of the first questions I ask is why? Why are you writing characters of these identities with these experiences? What's the goal here? And there are differences between writing a story about an experience that is something outside of your own that can often be fraught. So, for example, writing, like, if I'm not gay and I'm writing a gay viewpoint character and I decide to write a coming out story, and there are a lot of questions like, why are you choosing to write that? Is that your story to tell?
Mm-hmm.
Versus writing a character who is gay, who, of course, that is part of the person's identity and who they are and does shape their experiences, but the story isn't about that identity. So I mean, there are a lot of considerations there, but some of the biggest questions are, why are you choosing to tell the story? Are you the person to do it? Will you be possibly, especially in traditional publishing, will you possibly be taking away space from writers who are of this identity, who may not be getting the same opportunities as you are, to tell their own story? So those are some questions there. But as far as like canceling and things like that, I think that, I would hope that if a writer is writing a story and purposely creating these characters who are of these demographics, then hopefully they have respect for the people who actually are of those identities and of those demographics. If not, there are a lot of questions there. But I would hope that, framing authenticity reading as an act of respect and compassion and crafting as strong of a representation as can be done, without the intent to, again, say, oh no, everything's wrong, like I'm being offended by all of these things. But no, it's it's how can, if you want to create this story, how can you do so in a way that is, genuine, accurate, and again, respectful. I'm going to keep going back to that one, but that's what it comes down to, because at the end of the day, there are human beings who have these identities, unless, you're inventing a race or a species or a world. But if you're writing about the identities that people actually hold, that's going to affect real people. And it's also going to affect people, how other people see people of those identities too. So I think that engaging authenticity reading is an act of trying to be a better writer, a better storyteller too.
Yeah. So. Do you get pushback sometimes without naming names?
Yeah. Most of the time, if someone's reaching out to me for the service, it's because they at least on some level want it, or at least have been told by an agent or a publisher that they should have it. Part of it is I do offer feedback on representation and stereotypes and conscious language during my editing, where I'm not necessarily doing big picture developmental story level edits, but more looking at the language and the writing. But if I see problematic representation that I recognize as a harmful stereotype or a trope, then I often still do comment on it. Like, not if I'm doing a proofread, but where I'm probably working with an indie author and there is some room to still shape the characterization and the story, then I do provide feedback on that. So I don't always know what authors think of that, or whether or not they do or don't take that into consideration and change things. But I've had authors say that, they didn't realize that something came off as stereotyped or potentially harmful. But I have been met with some resistance as far as language level things. That's few and far between so far. So that's been a positive.
Yeah, that's encouraging. And what when you do sensitivity readings, how do you limit yourself? What kind of situations are you comfortable being sensitive to as a reader?
Yeah, so
I'm sorry, I keep calling it sensitive. Yeah, I keep calling it sensitivity reading. I said authenticity reading, which I like. I mean, it's right. I mean, sensitivity has its own sort of maybe negatives by some people, but authenticity, I think we all strive for authentic voice. In terms of topics, when people come to you, if people want to say, have people asked you, they say, I've got a Black character, is this true? Is this real?
Right. So my authenticity reading, I think this is what most authenticity readers do. It comes from that place of lived experience, either personal experience. I do offer some based on professional experience, but I do always put in the caveat that I can't speak to what it's like to actually go through this myself. But I have a list of topics that I can speak to, but I would never say that I can know what it's like to be a Black person. Like, that is not something I can do. But if someone were to, like, if I were editing something and I came across stereotypes or tropes or slurs or framing that is problematic, I can still offer feedback on that. But I can't say I have lived this life and can tell you what it's like and whether or not this may be accurate to my experience. Like, that is very limited. And I've seen a lot of confusion, and I get the confusion in differentiating between authenticity reading and what I call a conscious language assessment. Like, people will often ask me to provide feedback on conscious language, but they call it sensitivity reading. And I say, well, I am not this demographic, so I can't speak to that. But I can, again, I can look at it from the lens of language and what I know, but I can't, if you're asking me to speak on whether or not it's accurate and I'm done in a respectful way and what I as a reader of this background think, like that's not what I can provide to you. But there is so I see some confusion there. But yeah, I mean, for me, and I encourage all editors to do this, like we are all human beings, we are all readers. So if we have a reaction to something and we see something, even if it's not from our own experience, like we can still comment on problematic representation from our own lens and provide that type of feedback to writers.
Right. Okay. And we have, we as Heather said at the beginning, ask questions in the room. We'll try to get to them. And we do have a couple of questions to throw at you right now.
Sure. Yes, our first one is from Molly. Molly, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure, thank you so much. It is really awesome to be here. Crystal, I was wondering, do you find that people are more willing to pay for or take seriously authenticity reading than beta reading, which many authors expect and try to find for free?
Yeah. So again, I can't speak to like professional beta reading. I know there are beta readers who offer it for free, who do it as a paid service. So I've never done beta reading as like a formal thing, as I mentioned. But I do know that many beta readers are expected to do it for free. I'm not sure if it's more of a like that they're framed differently. So one is valuable, whereas the other isn't. So much so as, I know that at least with authenticity reading, there is a lot of pushback on doing it for free because of the amount of emotional labor that's often involved, that, authenticity readers are being asked to speak from their lived experience on stories that often contain, depictions of hate or traumatic experiences, or there's a lot of education on the part of the reader that is based in sometimes lifetimes of trauma and exploitation and marginalization. So there is a lot of pushback of like, I'm not doing this labor for free because like the author is coming to me because they can't get this elsewhere. And so I need to charge what it's worth. Whereas with beta reading, I think it's more, general feedback on a story from like a critique and assessment standpoint that is not asking the reader to use, their lived experiences and these potentially very harmful events that have happened or relying on that part of who they are. So I'm not saying that beta readers shouldn't be paid, but I think at least with authenticity reading, there is that aspect of it to consider.
Yeah, that's interesting. Something I hadn't considered. And of course, lived experience could be, you might seek out somebody who has had a traumatic experience that you're trying to deal with, that as an author, you don't, you haven't lived, you don't fully understand, but you might seek out somebody to be an authenticity reader just for that subject.
Right. Yeah. And something I talk about too is that I think a lot of people think of authenticity reading as, oh, it's race and culture, which is a big part of it, but there are so many other topics. One thing I don't know if people think about is there are readers who read for sexual assault, like people who have experienced it before. So to have to relive that through text and potentially very graphic and harmful depictions, to be asked to do that, again, the readers choose to, but that doesn't diminish what they've gone through and what is being asked of them. So it's not, so yes, sometimes stories are very easy and lighthearted and doesn't require that, but that doesn't change what a reader is bringing to the table.
Yeah. Okay. And I think we have another question up, ready to go.
We do. This one is from Heidi. Heidi, if you want to unmute and ask.
Sure. Hi, Crystal. I was just wondering, when in the process are you typically asked to do an authenticity read? And then I guess my question is kind of a two-parter. And then what is that versus when ideally should an authenticity reading take place?
Yeah, so I think that it should take place as early in the process as possible. There are times where an author will work with a reader more as like a consultant to come up with the story development to try to make sure that it is, done in a respectful way. That doesn't often happen as far as I've seen. I usually get manuscripts when usually before they've been edited, but I have gotten some that have been copy edited already. So that can lead to problems because if the authenticity read reveals that there are story level issues that need to be reworked, then of course, that ends up being a headache for the writer and may have cost them a lot of money if they have to get it re-edited and things like that. But I would say as like once the draft has been written at the least, like that, I think that would be a good place because then there isn't likely money to have been invested in getting it edited. But after the author at least has solid ideas of where they've gone with it.
Right. Okay. All right. We have several questions, and it kind of makes my job easier. I can just sit back and listen, pay attention. So Heather, who else do we have?
We have a question from Dana. Dana, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Crystal, this is awesome that you're doing this today. So how do you respond to clients who offer the following feedback on edits that include notes on conscious language? Quote, madly in love, crazy hot, crazed killer. You'd have to be insane too. I understand your reservations, but these are commonly used expressions.
Right. And the author's not wrong there. I think it's it sounds like the feedback has been explained already. And for me, I don't necessarily approach it as, and I don't know how you've approached it. So this may be what you've done. Because I get the hesitation or the really that's a problem type of attitude, especially with language that is so ingrained in our everyday that it, people will argue it has lost the meaning or the historical uses of it and everything. Ableist language, I think in particular, can be hard to help authors see because it's different from like when we talk about race and we say, oh, this has roots in racism and prejudice and things like that. I think a lot of authors are like, oh no, I don't want to come off that way. But with ableism, I think there's often, unfortunately, a very people just shrug it off like, oh, well, it's not a big deal. But I often approach it from the perspective of, it's not to say that you can't say this or that it's necessarily being ableist to use phrases like that, but it's more, what is the potential impact on readers? And so a reader who has been called these words before, especially in a disparaging way, how might they react to it? And I know we can't control every reader's reactions, but a reader who comes across language may have some kind of reaction to the word, whether it's used in a way that's targeted toward a person or just calling an event crazy or something. that, is that yes, it's common language. Is it necessary? Is that the only way to convey it? Are there other terms that really get the point across without the history of stigma behind the word? So I often try to frame it that way, that it's not so much, again, like you're using it in an ableist way, but think about how someone who has been hurt by this language before may see this usage. But whether or not the author listens, we can't always control that. But for me, it's bring it up and let them decide what to do with it. And like I'll have the conversations, but ultimately it's their manuscript.
Mhm. You've written about the topic of mental illness in fiction in blog entries. Why do we have trouble getting it right, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. I think just there's so much stigma and silence around mental illness that, well, it's a circle. I think like many people are open about it for good reason, because there's so much shame and around it. And so that means the only depictions that people really see are often in fiction, or they're sensationalized in news. And that furthers the stigma because we don't really talk about it. And we don't treat it as, I think a lot of people are open about physical conditions, but not so much mental illness. So you would never tell someone to stop taking their heart medication, that if they just believed hard enough, that they could overcome it. But we do that with mental illness. And so it's easy to villainize people we don't understand, or diseases we don't understand. And so that then furthers the silence with it, I feel. And so the blog posts that I wrote were about like how I see mental illness getting depicted in fiction, and common tropes that are often harmful, and encouraging people to think twice before making the villain, hear voices in their head, or that, or showing that someone with depression, doesn't need to take antidepressants because they just need to get over it, or things like that. So that's just something that I have that I've seen in media, and as a mental health professional, it always made me really angry
Yeah,
to see that. And so that's just something that I wrote, hoping that maybe authors or creative writers might, it might help them think about the tropes they may be relying on that are not often accurate.
Right. Okay. All right. We have more questions. We're just going to keep going.
Okay.
We do. Yes. Our next question is from V. V, if you want to unmute.
Sure. My question probably segues pretty well from what you just answered. I wanted to know, how is authenticity reading best approached for disability? I imagine it's best to still stick to lived experience, but I've seen many offering the service for more general disability related reading, or kind of a general subset like mental illness rather than a specific type. I imagine that's because there are so many types, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so kind of like what I mentioned with the difference between authenticity reading and reading for conscious language in general. I think for an author to get as accurate of a picture, as much nuanced feedback as possible, it is best to hire someone with the disability that is being depicted, because there are so many disabilities that exist, so many different ways disabilities can manifest. Two people with the same disability can experience them in many different ways. So I do encourage writers to try to match that as closely as possible. But I think there is value in looking at depictions of disability on a broader level when it's more about language used. So I've had a similar question before where an editor was asking like, oh, if I know that this writer is going to have an authenticity reader read this manuscript, do I still need to flag language issues around that? And I think in that case, it was mental illness. And I encourage, like, yes, still flagging it, because while an authenticity reader may be able to speak to the experiences and whether that may be accurate to the disability, then they may or may not be well versed in the language used, like that disability advocates may be using currently, things like that. So I think that there are different ways of approaching it, but that lived experience is important for that disability if possible. But I don't know that there's anything wrong in saying that, like, oh, I offer the service from a more general standpoint, as long as it's made clear that that's what's being done, that it's not, oh, I can tell you that this is accurate even when I've never lived through that before, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think we all, as editors, those of us who are editors, I mean, that's part of the job is looking at the language and deciding what might be awkward or difficult for a reader to accept, that they sort of gets in the way of telling your story because you're putting something out there that people are going to focus on that's not what you intend. Right. And there are, and in a minute, I want to ask you about resources, including your own resource, the toolkit you put together. But I think we have at least one more question, so I don't want to miss out on questions.
We do. We have a question from Laura. Laura, if you want to unmute and ask.
I have a question about your experience of doing authenticity or sensitivity readings for fiction and nonfiction, and if that differs very much. I would imagine that, for example, that stories that are memoirs are nonfiction, but they might have a lot of similarity to the sensitivity readings, authenticity readings that you do for fiction. But what about other types of nonfiction? Do you do readings for them?
I do. I don't have much experience with them. Most of my experience has been with fiction, but I have reviewed textbook materials. And textbooks are one where there is a lot of confusion with, like, authenticity reading and reading from a more, like, on a broader language level with conscious language. And, all these textbook companies are talking about, we want to look at it from like a DEI perspective and all those things. So the one textbook I have done was a vignette on a Chinese family. So that was truly an authenticity read because it was from my lived experience. But I have done assessments of, again, language and general usage for nonfiction as well. But yeah, textbooks are a big one, and with fiction and nonfiction, again, it still comes from the place of what's my experience. But I think with fiction, there are different issues that have to be looked at too, like the story elements. Is it historical fiction, and things like that. But Laura, I don't know if that answers your question, but if you have like more thoughts or.
No, it definitely does, because I think that most of the talk has been about story, but I think it applies to memoir. And I think you bring up the equity, diversity, inclusion point, that, you know, it shades into that area, and it's an interesting discussion. But
Yeah,
thank you
and
very much.
yeah, to that point with memoir, I don't have a lot of experience with memoir either, but something that I've seen and read about is sometimes it's not so much about language, and this applies to fiction too. It's more about tone and framing.
Mhm.
So say like someone travels to another country, the way that they write about that country, is it exoticizing them? Is it dehumanizing them? Like what's the lens in which it's written? Like that's a part of authenticity reading too, that and conscious language, I feel, that often gets overlooked in favor of like the words and phrases themselves, but it's also looking at it from the perspective of how is this written, how is this framed. And I think memoirs can maybe be a little tricky because the writer is writing from their own perspective of it. So there might be more resistance to changing that, but it's, you know, how is this being shown to your reader, and how would that make me as a reader of this identity that you're writing about feel?
Thank you.
I read a interesting nonfiction example. I just read a story about how life in Afghanistan is sort of returning to normal, in that people aren't afraid to go out of their houses and travel. There aren't going to be roadside bombs anymore. There aren't checkpoints. So even though you have the Taliban, it's sort of everything seems to be at least manageable. And then paragraph 8, it says something like, well, except for women. You know, so the perspective is entirely male. And then it seems like some editor said, you know, you should stick a paragraph in there about how women are afraid to leave the house. So let's talk about resources. And, you know, and I always say, I want to get to know you. I say this show shouldn't be all about information, and there's tons of great information, and I, you know, that's what people want. We're asking, we've got lots of questions today, and that's great. But anyway, we'll get back to you later. First of all, tell me what the best resources are for, not for somebody who necessarily wants to do authenticity reading, but for somebody who's editing and wants to be aware of the language and the situations, and to be able to explain why something might not be desirable.
Right. So I have to start with Conscious Style Guide, which, you know, Karen Yin started off this conversation, I think, for editors. And so Conscious Style Guide is always my go-to recommendation when someone is looking for just general information or specifics, because it really does take you to so many different areas. And Karen does such a great job curating the resources there. I also refer to the American Psychological Association's Bias-Free Language Guide, which is excellent and has great guidance. The different journalistic associations for various groups, like it's alphabet soup, but
right.
NABJ, AAJA, NAHJ, NHAA, the Trans Journalist Association, the GLAD Media Reference Guide for LGBTQ plus language. Did I say NCDJ's Disability Style Guide? Yeah, there are a lot, and those are just some of the go-to ones that I name, but there are so many out there, and it can be overwhelming. But that's why I often I recommend starting with Conscious Style Guide, because it does link to all of these things.
Right. And as does your Conscious Language Toolkit, which is just a terrific, I mean, it has by sort of type of thing you're interested in. It gives sort of the higher level focus of what you should be aware of, what you should be conscious of, and then also links to all these various sources and columns and articles. And so I have the conscious language toolkit for editors, which is great. And then there's also a conscious language toolkit for writers, which I didn't buy. What's the
Right.
difference? Is it the
Yeah,
same
so-
thing,
so
or
I-
is it?
It's pretty much the same thing. So I tell
Yeah.
people if they are both an editor and a writer, the editor toolkit covers everything in the writer toolkit. It's just the editor toolkit has more to it because it has things for editors to keep in mind, like how to approach things, how to query, and like 30 examples of actual queries that can be used and tweaked. But really the goal, because like I just mentioned, there are so many resources out there, and I found myself really overwhelmed by all the information out there and just trying to figure out like, okay, as I'm leaving feedback for a writer, what should I say? I always want to link to resources that back up my recommendation. What should I provide? So really that's why I created the toolkit, to hopefully make it easier for editors who are doing the work in providing links and reasons and explanations that could hopefully be easy to change to fit the needs, but also to encourage editors who aren't leaving the feedback but may want to and are feeling overwhelmed and just unsure of how to even start, to help them be able to do that easier, hopefully. So
You've only been doing this a couple of years. I first became aware of you when we were going to have the ACES conference in Salt Lake City. You said, "Yay, I'm in Salt Lake City,"
I know.
and you were like, and no, it was just wonderful because you said, "What can I do? Let me know. I want to help." And you've been involved with the EFA, the Editorial Freelancers Association, and now you're on the board, a fellow where we share a role as does Heather, our producer. We're all on the board of, we don't have a quorum, do we? No. We're all on the board of the American Copy Editor Society, or ACES, the Society for Editing. So, and you've got this toolkit. You're blogging. You've done a lot of interview shows like this one. Do you think? How do you feel? Do you think you're making a difference?
I hope so. Feedback has been positive from whenever I do presentations, or sometimes I just get random messages from people saying that they found my resources helpful, and really that's what I can hope for. I never thought I would be doing this. Like I thought, oh, when I become an editor, I will be editing books, which is what I do. But I also have done a lot more than that, which I was not planning. And I wasn't planning, like I thought that when I left social work, like when I stopped practicing, that I was leaving the profession really, but it's been really neat to be able to apply a lot of my background and just things I learned in school into what I do, which was kind of a happy accident. But yeah, I would like to think so. It's been a whirlwind, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, I think so. Yeah, I mean, do you have time for your day job? Is that?
I do edit.
Yeah.
I do edit.
Good. And what's and tell us, what's your involvement with EFA?
Yeah, so I am part of the diversity initiative. I'm a regular EFA member, but EFA also has the diversity initiative to really help look at DEI issues in the EFA. It's not like a structural thing. It's made up of EFA members who talk about issues and may bring up issues to the board, but really looking at how can we make the EFA a more welcoming space. And I also, today is the last day of teaching the EFA copy editing fiction class. So I just finished doing that for the first time. It runs for 4 weeks. So those are my two big things that I do. Oh, and I'm also a part of the EFA's Welcome program, which is like a kind of not quite a mentorship program, but a welcomer gets paired with an EFA newcomer to just really talk them through what all the EFA has to offer. And again, it's to help make the EFA feel like a welcoming space.
Mhm. Right, right. And we have resources. We've had, you mentioned Karen Yin, we've had Sanjita Mehta from
Mhm.
EFA. So on our YouTube page, go if you haven't seen those shows, those chat shows, go have a look. They're
Mhm.
very interesting on this topic. So what's next? Do you have any plans?
Still editing, but
Yeah.
I am planning in talks with some other international editing organizations to do presentations and workshops
Okay.
on a few things.
Mhm. Are you doing CIEP or
I
did you?
did I
did do that,
presented
yeah.
2 sessions
Right.
at the CIEP conference
Right.
mid-September. Yep.
Yeah.
So that was my
Okay.
first like presentation abroad, which was
Uh-huh.
neat. I wish it had been
Yeah.
in person. That would have been cool.
Yeah.
but,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Well, actually, that's the next thing. Once we can travel again. I mean, San Antonio in the spring hopefully is going to happen. That's not that far for you, but at least it's getting out of Utah for a
it's
little
my
bit.
home state, so
Oh yeah. Right behind you. We got the right. Okay. But then, yeah, I mean, you've got to get over to England. You've got to get to Australia. I've never been. Canada is easy. Well, reasonably easy. Depends where it is. But all right. I think we're. Well, we have a few more
quite a few
minutes. I
minutes
guess.
left. Yeah.
Yeah. We did have a question about. I'll try to ask it myself. We had a question about proofreading. And so like, if do you ever do proofreading and get to the proofreading stage
I
and
do. Mhm.
notice, is that more difficult to flag things at that point?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of proof. I have when I'm proofreading for indie authors, where again, if it's a language thing and and I'm proofreading in the sense of like a last pass on a Word document and they can change things, then I do still flag things that can be easily changed. I'm probably not going to suggest an overhaul of the story at that stage. For
Right.
publishers, I haven't run into that issue yet. And unless something was absolutely egregious, then I probably wouldn't touch anything or flag anything on a proofread. It just depends on what it is and like who the client is, what the issue is, and how easily fixable it would be. But
Mhm.
yeah, proofreading is tough in that regards because there are so many limitations there. But I wouldn't say like, oh, I won't do something because it's a proofread. But the context does come into play.
Yeah, right. Okay. So tell us, we've talked, this has been full of information, like I said. Tell us something about you that we don't know.
That we don't know. Well, I don't know. This is like my go-to fact, but I think
Okay.
some people know it.
If
So
you
it may
keep
not be
using it, then
I
people
know.
know
I
it.
need to
Yeah.
come up with a new one, but people seem to enjoy it. But
All right.
I met my husband playing an online video game called Final Fantasy 11 back in 2009, which
I did not know that.
it was not before, but I feel like a lot of people weren't fond of or okay with even like online dating as in like matchmaking websites.
Yeah.
So if I
Yeah, it was-
said like if I told someone that we met even online, like I remember people like laughing at me,
Yeah.
saying like that's ridiculous. Like who would
Yeah,
do
now, right. And now like
that?
half the people, more than half, probably half the relationships start online, especially during pandemic days, I guess.
Yeah, it's pretty par for the course, I think now. But yeah, I love playing video games, so
Mhm.
We met as strangers and did not, we dated for 2 years long distance
Wow.
because we lived in different states, and we saw each other in person 4 times over those 2 years, but we were both
Wow.
in school, but we played online together every day. We watched movies. We used a program called Ventrilo to talk voice to voice. It's basically like old school Discord.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, we would sync up movies at the same time and say 3, 2, 1, play, and we would hit play, and it would often be off by a little bit. So one of
Right.
us would like laugh before the other one did, but I mean, it's
It
worked.
worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. So when the pandemic hit and you're forced to do everything remotely, you were kind of ready for that sort of thing.
We share
right?
an office now, so
Yeah.
we are, whether good
Yeah.
or bad, like that.
Yes,
But we
my wife
actually,
is across the hall, right?
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're out of time, but it's been great to get to know you and talk to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. But I feel like we've gotten to know each other pretty well, various places already. Well, thank you very much. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with this is one I'm going to really enjoy, the Fred Shapiro edited the new edition of the Yale Book of Quotations. I love books of quotations, and it's something as an editor that it just seems like with all the quotation sites that are out there, everybody wants to put in this clever quote in whatever they're writing, and 80% of the time it's wrong. It's not really who said it. So
Yeah, I'm glad I haven't run across too many epigraphs to have to
Oh, really?
verify. So I've been fortunate that way.
I've had some writers, it's just a regular thing, and every time I have to say, no, that wasn't really Benjamin Franklin, etc.
Well, thanks for
Anyway,
inviting me.
yeah, it's been great. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks everybody else for coming. We'll see you in 2 weeks, hopefully.
Bye.
Bye-bye.